today we're going to pick up with our Esther story that we started last week. So let me remind you of a few of the main characters in the Esther story. First, there was the king of the province, or the king of the kingdom of Persia, and his name was King Xerxes. He was a prideful man. He thought everybody needed to be really super impressed with who he was. And then he had a new wife, and her name was Queen Esther. Queen Esther was a young Jewish girl who was beautiful. And so when they had chosen the beautiful girls in the kingdom and brought them before the king, he got to choose who he wanted to have as his new wife, and he chose Esther, who became the queen, and King Xerxes was the king. Esther was raised by a man named Mordecai, who was a Jewish man. Now, Esther was Jewish too, but Mordecai had told her not to tell anybody that she was Jewish. So Mordecai was a nice Jewish man who had adopted Esther when her mom and dad died and raised her as his very own daughter. And then the last player in the story is a guy named Haman. The king had chosen Haman to be his new prime minister, and so when the king chose Haman to be the new prime minister, Haman was super proud, and he wanted people to bow down to him when he walked by. That's proud, isn't it? Can you imagine somebody thinking that they're so great that somebody should bow down to them? Well, Haman thought that, and he went to King Xerxes and asked King Xerxes to make a new rule that said that everyone had to bow down to him when he passed by. Well, Mordecai, the Jewish man who was the one who raised Esther, decided he wasn't bowing down to Haman because he was a Jewish man and he wasn't going to bow down to anybody except God. Well, people began to ask questions of Mordecai. Why aren't you bowing down to Haman? Why aren't you bowing down to Haman? So it came out that he was a Jewish man. So word got back to Haman that Mordecai wasn't bowing down to him because he was Jewish. He was one of God's chosen people, the Israelites. Well, Haman was mad. So he went to the king and he said, King, I think you need to do something about these Jewish people. And if you told everyone in your kingdom to kill Jewish people, then you could get rich because you could take all of their possessions and you would get richer. So the king said, okay, Haman, I will make a rule that all the Jewish people have to be killed. Now remember, he did not know that Esther was Jewish, okay? So he makes that rule, and back then the king would wear a ring that would have his sign or initial or something, and they would pour a little wax on the paper when the wax was wet, and he would put his ring on that wax, and the rule, the law, the edict would be sealed, and that's exactly what the king did. Well, when Mordecai heard about it, the Bible tells us that he put on sackcloth and ashes. That means that he put on clothes that would show that he was in mourning. He was in brokenheartedness, that he was weeping and upset because something horrible was wrong. And so Mordecai, in his sackcloth and ashes, his mourning clothes, not mourning like your mourning pajamas, but mourning like I'm mourning because I'm so sad, I'm mourning because my heart is broken. He was sitting outside the palace gate, and he was crying and wailing and so upset. And word got back to Esther, and Esther sent somebody out to say, Mordecai, what is wrong? And she sent some regular clothes that he could put on that weren't sackcloth and ashes. When the person got out there with Mordecai, Mordecai refused the regular clothes. And he said, let me tell you what's going on. And I want to read to you from Esther chapter 4. It says, when Queen Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused it. Then Esther sent for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed as her attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was in mourning. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the square in front of the palace gate. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all the Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Now remember, Esther had not told anybody that she was Jewish. But when she finds out what had happened, when this man comes back and gives her the report, and that Mordecai wants her to go before the king without being invited, she had to send another message back to Mordecai. And she said, Mordecai, if anybody in this kingdom goes to see the king and goes into his presence and they weren't invited, they can be killed immediately. Well, you know what Mordecai said to her? Mordecai said, Esther, God will send somebody to rescue his people. God is going to send somebody so that his people aren't destroyed. But if you don't speak up, then you and your family will be killed. So it kind of seems like she's in a bad spot, huh? She's kind of in a bad spot because if she doesn't go to the king, all the Jewish people will be killed. If she does go to the king, she could be killed and the Jewish people still be killed. Now, Esther had grown up as a Jewish girl, and he knew the stories of the promises that God had made to Abraham. God had promised Abraham that he was going to make him into a great nation and that those people were going to be God's chosen people. And God had also said, anyone who blesses my people, I'll bless. Anyone who curses my people, I will curse. Esther knew all of those things, but still, she was wanting to go to see the king uninvited. It was a huge risk. Now, you remember last week that we talked about when we find out that we have an enemy who plots against us, that we don't have to respond in fear, but we have to respond in focus. So Esther was finding out that she had an enemy who was plotting against her and her people. And remember how we talked about that we have an enemy who plots against us because he does not want us to follow God. He does not want us to live for God. And he wants to distract us from all of those things that would cause us to be in a relationship with God. He wants to distract us. Esther had been pretty focused on being the queen. She had not asked to be in that position, but she was there because of her beauty. And when you were the queen in Persia, pretty much your whole deal was that you were a beauty contestant. And so that's what she was. But now she was being asked to be focused on something completely different. So she sends another message to Mordecai and says, please ask the Jewish people to pray for me, to fast, because when I go to the king, if he does not extend his golden scepter to me, then I will be killed. You see, that's what the king would do. If somebody went to the king, if he extended his golden scepter, that means, okay, I invite you in, you can come. But if he does not extend his golden scepter, that person can be killed immediately. So Esther asked the Jewish people all over the kingdom of Persia to pray and to fast. Fast means to give up something that you really love. A lot of times it's associated with food, like missing a meal so that you can spend that time focusing and praying on what God wants for you. Well, Esther was asking the Jewish people to fast and to pray. So here we go. She's standing outside the room where the king is. She's knowing that there's a possibility that if the king does not extend the golden scepter, she is going to be killed immediately. Remember, the king doesn't know that she's Jewish. But she's standing outside the room. Do you think her heart is beating fast? I bet. She remembered the stories of how God had promised that he was going to be faithful to his people. But she also knew what the king's rules were, and he could just choose to have her killed. So she's waiting outside the room. I bet her heart's beating really, really fast. I bet she's nervous. She's getting ready to walk in. She doesn't know what the king's going to do. And we're going to have to wait till next week to find out what happens, to find out whether the king will listen to her and will extend his golden scepter. But in the meantime, I want to talk to you for just a minute about what it means for us to be focused on God. Remember, we talked about that the enemy has a plot against us. He doesn't want us to follow God. He doesn't want us to be obedient to him. But here's what it means to be focused. In 1 John chapter 5, verse 3, it says this: loving God means keeping his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. Loving God means keeping his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. How do we focus on God? We love him, and out of our love for him, we obey him. We obey what he tells us in his word. When we love God, we know that we can trust him, and we know that he's a good God. And when we love him and get to know him more and more and more, and we understand more and more and more what he's like, then we understand more and more that he is the one who deserves our love. He deserves our obedience. So I wonder about you this week, and I wonder about me this week. Will we focus? Remember, we don't respond out of fear when we find out we have an enemy. We respond in focus. So how are we going to focus? Let's focus on getting to know God more, and as we get to know him more, let's love him and obey him. And his word says that when we love him and obey him, his commandments are not burdensome. It's not like we have to say, oh, I can't do this, it's too hard, because he gives us everything that we need. I love you, I miss you, and I cannot wait to see you again. Have a great week.